It's great to be here. Thanks all the panelists for coming. Um, yeah, I'm Sloan Leong. This panel is visual world building and comics and illustration. And we have four great panelists with us. So maybe I can have y'all introduce yourselves. Let's start with Karis. Did I say your name right? I was practicing.
Yes, that's great.
Okay, go ahead and introduce yourself then.
Sure. Hi, I'm Karis. I'm an illustrator and comics editor. I'm normally based in Malaysia, but right now I'm in the UK doing my master's. So I tend to do a lot of freelance illustration for books, usually YA or fantasy. And I've also done a lot of illustration work for things like games, character design, for musicals, and a lot of non-profit work. So I think for this panel, I'll be kind of focusing on um, the aspects of like maps and clothes when it comes to world building, because it's what I've done a lot of so far.
Awesome. Madeline, do you want to go next?
Sure. My name's Madeline Holly Rosing. I'm the writer-creator of the Steampunk Supernatural series, Boston Metaphysical Society. I've worked with two artists so far. Emily Hugh did my first 6-issue miniseries, and Gwen Tavares is on board doing the art and coloring for our sequels. We're actually on our fourth sequel right now, which is, and sorry, shameless plug, is on Kickstarter right now, uh, about halfway through. And I've been in the comics industry now for about 8 years. It's been that long, 8, 9 years, something like that.
Excellent. Trivia, do you want to go next?
Yeah, so hi, I'm Trivia Fox, they, them pronouns, and I am associate producer of tabletop role-playing games at Renegade Game Studios. So I'm coming at this panel from the realm of working with licensed IP and what you're able to do in that place while, figuring out how to be creative while under very strict licensed property. So there we go.
Excellent. And Bruce.
I'm Bruce Bernizzi. I'm a freelance illustrator. I've been working for about 6, 7 years now, mostly in tabletop gaming, but also like indie games and some book covers and things of that nature. Mostly known for my work on a tabletop setting called Numenera, indie game called Slay the Spire, and recently working on Magic the Gathering.
Awesome. And I forgot to introduce myself. I'm Sloan Leong. I'm a cartoonist and writer. I'm most well known for a series called Prism Stalker, which is like psychedelic indigenous sci fantasy and yeah, some short fiction. But yeah, I'm really excited to talk about this. I feel like visual world building, I don't see it talked about in like art spaces that much. I see it more dug into with like fiction and writing. But I feel like it's really important to think about like the not just like the ethics of things, but what like the impact is of drawing from like different like cultural or real life inspiration. So yeah, maybe just to start, we can talk about our processes for how we start building the visuals for worlds. Um, Maybe Madeline, do you want to start? How do you start conceptualizing visual like the world in your art and stories?
Well, for in particular Boston Metaphysical, I am starting with a real world base. It's an alternate history of the United States, which I refer to as the Great States of America. Yet supernatural elements exist. It's an organic part. The steampunk part is uh, there's steampunk elements, but it's more steampunk-ish. But yet we do use that aesthetic. Um, throughout the series, mainly because there's a certain expectation when you say steampunk that you have a certain amount of steampunk aesthetic within the art and the world you're doing. But the world itself is built on a real 1880s Boston. The buildings, the structures, um, the narrow streets, the cobblestones, uh, even down to the way people dress. And Gwen, when she first came on board, it was actually pretty funny. In all my scripts, I also add on images, reference images for her so she isn't burdened with all the research. And I say, like, okay, look at this, look at that, use this for inspiration. But occasionally she'll go off on her own, and then I'll see a post of like, oh, I'm studying, the socks of how, people, what socks look like in 1895.
Uh-oh, we lost Madeline. While they're recovering their signal, Karis, do you want to add to that?
Yeah, I'm gonna try to share my screen and see if it's working.
Perfect.
Oh yeah, I think it did.
Yay!
Oh, cool.
Yeah, so I'm just gonna very quickly talk about like the map aspect. So what I do is I illustrate maps for fantasy books. I've been mostly doing them for Orbit. So this is the map for Kaysen's Queen of the Conquered and King of the Rising. So for me, like I try to treat maps as part of the world itself, like they're an artifact from the world. They are created by the people of that world, and therefore it reflects their cultures. So I think they're a really neat tool to kind of do world building, because in a fantasy novel, the visuals are just the cover, maybe the back cover, the map if there's a map, and like chapter spots. So for this particular map, there's a bunch of islands who've been colonized, and each island is kind of ruled by a different family. So I was thinking we can kind of get it across by having the different coins for each island, because they're rich enough to mint their own money, and therefore each of them is going to have a very specific kind of coin. The borders of the map actually kind of tell you the real story, which sort of reflects the plot of the book, where now I'm not going to give things away, but if you're not paying attention to the margins, you kind of miss out on a lot of things. So even the types of borders are supposed to kind of reflect the world of the map. I think even for fantasy worlds, which are kind of drawing from real world cultures, like this is taking a lot from like different Asian cultures. But I try to kind of stick to what the author has set out in their book. So for example, here they've established that we have kind of 4 different kingdoms or empires, so the borders kind of reflect the different cultures. Like the one with the horse is actually for a kind of nomadic tribe, and I think where they stay, they have 2 moons or something. So all of that is kind of subtly reflected in the map. Yeah, so those are just examples of how I've been trying to do world building in a very kind of confined space, but still try to make the most of it.
I love this so much.
Those are gorgeous.
I may hire you. I already put a note here. It's like, talk to her later.
Paris does not mess around with maps. Yeah, I love the elements, like in that first map you showed. It looked like there was, like you're saying, in the borders, there's possibly like woven grass and like different elements. So I was like immediately like, oh, is that like their main agriculture, like in that part of the archipelago? Or like there's so much you can seed in with just all those tiny details. Did you have to kind of do that research yourself, or did the authors provide like the details in that respect?
I think it really depends on the author. So normally they give you kind of a very rough like pencil sketch of the map to kind of show you where everything is geographically. But I always read the full manuscript before I work on the map. So I'm reading the whole story. I'm like taking notes down about the cultures, the characters, and then trying to kind of put as much as that as possible into the final piece. So yeah, I do end up doing a lot of research myself.
Very cool. Yeah, I love the also the second map. It's like very luxurious, and it like speaks more to like a maybe coming from a more like noble, I don't know, someone with like a lot of money who's using this more as like a piece of art than like something more practical. Very cool. I love it. Does anyone else have experience like making maps? Like I don't really make maps not as beautiful as that, just for my own personal reference, but yeah, does
Oh
anyone
yeah,
have like map thoughts?
oh yeah, absolutely. I'd say that maps before illustration were actually the main form of art that I ever did growing up. And mainly what I did in classes, instead of listening to the teacher, was turning over the worksheet and doing a map on the back. And in a way, like maps were a great way of sort of note taking that whole world building process for me because I would build like the geology and the cultures and everything, and I'd find ways to represent that and sort of take notes as I was going and as I was building. And I haven't gotten back to that recently, but I definitely want to because that's a big part of my childhood.
Very cool. Um, Trivia, do you want to go next on that question of how you start conceptualizing
Yeah.
worlds?
So, when in working with licensed IP, sometimes all you're given is just a PDF from the publisher or the license holder that's like, here are a whole bunch of assets that we use for packaging of the characters you have access to. Here's a few little paragraphs about, the cornerstones of the brand and that kind of stuff. And then that's it. And so, we have worked with a team of, fans and experts as writers and things like that. But one of the first things that we make is sort of an asset Bible, an asset document where, you go through the whole of the product line and you're writing down like important characters, important places, important things, plot points, and like in a huge list. I have a spreadsheet right now that's hundreds of cells deep, like organized by season, right? Because it's for a TV show. Um, and that kind of gives you the skeleton that you have to work with. So you're like, oh, okay, I can use X character in X place with X artifact. And the hard part there is figuring out what you can push on the sides of, right? Like what new stories are you able to create that doesn't conflict with any of the current IP, or what characters are you able to make any new characters at all? Is a big question. Or are you able to depict characters doing certain actions is another big one. So having that huge list of what you're able to have access to is super helpful once it all gets down into that. And depending on the license holder, they might have you send in a number of outlines. Like, for this book, we'd like to have these story beats using these characters, and then they approve that. But for some license holders, they're like, we don't have time to look at this until it's done. So you do a whole, 300-page book and send it in
Seems
and
like a
hope.
risk.
Yep.
Yeah.
But that's why having people that are super knowledgeable about the IP is so important, because in our conversations we'll bring up something and they'll be like, so and so wouldn't do that. Here's an example of a time that they were completely against it. And you're like, bless your encyclopedic knowledge of this IP before we went down a road where we could never return. But yeah, so it's a really interesting like creative exercise. Like it can feel constraining at times, but also, when you can find something super interesting in there that uh, can get approved, it's like, I've made something new for something that I really liked as a kid, or things like that. So yeah.
Very cool. That sounds like so challenging. I'm like, oh God. Yeah, that's amazing. That's so much to think about. We will dig further into that later. I think also to like go back to maps and also just geography in general. I feel like that's probably where I start when I'm building a world. Like recently, sorry if you can hear a puppy crying. Um, I'm working on a book right now and I was like, okay, I was like, what are some interesting, like, I wanted to do like pink clay houses, like adobe, like tightly packed, almost like Santorini, but if it was pink. And I was like, oh, okay, like they must use like white clay to make their buildings or whatever. And then I was researching, they actually use lava rock, which is black, but because it absorbs so much heat, they have to paint it white so that they don't, get cooked alive. And I was like, oh, that is so cool. And like growing up in Hawaii, they don't really use lava rock for architecture, maybe like walls. So it's cool to just see the same like, natural element used so differently or used at all. Um, yeah, how do you feel about geography? I mean, I feel like that's such a core thing and like geography and like natural resources and like starting to build blocks of a culture. What are your thoughts on that? Karis,
I
do you want to
think
go first? Oh, Bruce can go.
sure. I was just going to say it was interesting that you added resources in there because resources are the basis of economy, and economy is the basis of so much about human civilization. So I think that's certainly a really interesting entry point, although maybe a little far from our visual roots as far as like how we might normally approach visual world building, but definitely something that you want to take into consideration before you're, illustrating any scene that involves characters and civilization and stuff. You want to know, okay, what are they actually using as their resources, as their valuable things? What do they value? Um, that's going to tell you a lot about the kind of decorations that they have and what they're even able to do as far as infrastructure.
Yeah, for sure. And it's also fun because you can kind of work backwards. Like I was like, oh, I want a pink city. And then I was like,
Hmm.
okay, how would I make that happen? Like maybe the pigment they have to use is like crushed seashells and they have like an abundance of those. And like, how would I go about building a culture that had like, I don't know, that used seashells as the main form of like building material? I don't know. Yeah.
And then you get to ask the question, like, for the very rich people, right, that are trying to show off how rich they are, what is the thing they have, like, none of? Like, do they have no wood? So
Mm.
a wooden structure that rots in the wet that can go on
Yes.
fire, like, now that is the fancy thing because you can
They're like,
afford
what
to
is
rebuild
hot?
it.
Okay.
Yeah.
Uh, Yeah, where does Madeline, Karis, do you have any thoughts on that? Do you start there? Do you start more on like a practical level, or are you more like, okay, I have a cool visual idea and then like kind of make up stuff to support that?
Um, like I said, I do use real world examples and then embellish on it. Uh, I have had a map made of my version of Boston, which is roughly the same, except some of the neighborhoods are a little different. Um, and Beacon Hill is still Beacon. If you've heard of Beacon Hill, it's
Hmm.
where the Boston Brahmins lived. And I mean, I call them something else, but their houses are even more extravagant than what was in real life. Uh, it's the social structure is very hierarchical, um, but it's it is, since it's not a fantasy world, it is a little bit easier for me to describe to my artist where we're going with everything, because we don't have to create it from scratch, like you do with a fantasy or science fiction world. So yeah, we do. I think it's a little bit easier, so we don't have to worry so much about, you know, if we're using wood or stone or that, if it exists in that world, because obviously it exists in our world, and we can go from there.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, I mean, I actually wanted to ask Bruce because you've worked on a lot of very like speculative
Mm.
environments,
Yeah.
the kind of paintings you do. So how would you imagine that sort of thing where we don't really have a basis to kind of go on, or like maybe the chemistry of that world's different, so the
I
physics
mean, I
would be
have
different
a couple
stuff.
different processes that are kind of almost like opposite ends of the spectrum. Sometimes I start like very illustration-y just with like thumbnails and just, putting down abstract blobs and I work from there. I see what I see in the blobs and I start to make up a story about them and like, okay, this thing means, like what is the relationship between the visual parts? and then I just keep building, and it's like, okay, asking a series of if this, then that kind of questions about what I'm creating and just sort of evolving it. But on the other end of the spectrum, sometimes it's very useful to start with just words and just writing down ideas. And so, like the example of starting with a resource would be a good example of that, where you're like, okay, I have a cool idea for, let's say like this seashell, resource. What things can I extrapolate from that? And so I might do kind of like a word map, um, based on, starting with that idea, and then kind of building out notes like, okay, well, maybe like these seashells are actually like poisonous like cone shells are in the real world, and people have to take certain precautions, and they're more difficult actually to get these things that they need to not bake alive. And so I'll do all of the world building in that way, and then I'll come up with visuals to support that. So, honestly, I like to stay kind of flexible and figure out what the project needs. In terms of like, I think the most out there stuff that I do is for Numenera, where they're like, okay, the world a billion years from now, and the one thing that we absolutely need in every image is that it has to feel super weird. It can have like maybe a couple elements that we sort of recognize, but it has to feel really out there. Um, and so usually for those ones, I actually start with less grounded world building, because I want to be as free as possible to just like literally like go super abstract, modernist, even kind of art, um, thumbnailing, and then dial it back towards, okay, like in all of this, these weird shapes that we don't know what they are. How are people living? What kinds of, these ruins that are here from past civilizations, what could they mean? And then try and leave it open-ended enough um, so that the player can actually insert themselves into that world, and they can come up with solutions for, okay, this means that. So I don't actually want to answer all the questions for them in that case. I want to leave it so that they have options that they can come up with, and they can take ownership of their version of that world that they're playing with their players.
I love that. Um, yeah, I like what you said about like when you're approaching a piece, kind of seeing things in the shapes and colors that you're setting down. It's kind of very like I totally have the same kind of feeling towards that. Like you can kind of just let things develop free form and like follow your like visual truth.
Yeah.
um, but yeah, maybe we can like all talk about how we kind of build our visual library um in more practical ways, but also in more creative ways, like Bruce was talking about, where you're just kind of like feeling color and shape out on the page. Karis, do you want to start with that?
Yeah, I guess I'll maybe now like take the example of clothes, because I've been fascinated by them for like a bunch of years. Let's go back to. So this is one of the, I guess, an example of like a creative exercise that I kind of do, where I'm like, all right, I have all these like pop culture things that I like, and I'm also really interested in Southeast Asian traditional clothes, because I'm born, live and work here in Southeast Asia. So what I would do is, take something. So here, for examples, the top left is like Dragon Age Inquisition, the video game. Top right is N.K. Jemisin's The Fifth Season, the novel. Bottom left is like New Gaiman's American Gods, and then the bottom right is like Lord of the Rings, and be like, okay, so I have like these existing worlds, and there are all these existing characters in the world. Can I come up with a design that draws from Southeast Asian traditional clothes, but which communicates the character? So like in the in like the bottom right with the four Lord of the Rings ones, like you can kind of tell which one is the Balrog,
Mm.
just from the design. And so I'm kind of drawing from two things at once. You have like the real world kind of clothing inspiration, and then you have someone else's sort of fictional ideas. And I find that's a really it's a really good exercise for me to kind of like work through things because I'm not trying to start from zero. So I have things to pull from and kind of mix and match. And we can definitely talk later on about, like where it potentially becomes problematic if you're pulling from all this like real world kind of designs. So another example, like the Dragon Age game. So I'm also trying to kind of like match the real world examples closely in terms of culture. So for example, like the one on the left, Dorian in the game is kind of he's from nobility, like a rich family. And so the Javanese kind of outfit that is based on is also something that only nobility would wear in Java. It's not a commoner's kind of clothes. And then like the one on the right, Vivian is this kind of very powerful sorcerer in the game who uses like ice and cold magic. So that's pulling from the Filipino like terno with the very distinctive butterfly sleeves, and then kind of using the like pattern and motif to add in the narrative about who she is and like what she does. And this, at the same time, the terno is also something that only the upper class or like the nobility would kind of wear. So yeah, I try to kind of have that element of yeah, like reality in there as well, and I'm not just kind of pulling things because they look cool. I'm also pulling
Right.
because in the real world there's a reason for them to look that way.
Very cool. I
Yeah,
love
So
all these
excellent.
designs so
those are
much.
gorgeous. Those are so
Yeah.
gorgeous. Yeah, when we saw Karis's all those lovely designs come up, it's not so much in the comics that you see this for Boston Metaphysical, but in the prose, where I have distinguished the fashion very, like I said, it's very hierarchical structured society, and the upper class do wear like their corsets on the outside, not on the inside, and their clothing is also interwoven with like metal filaments. So if you're wearing gold and platinum, then you're in a great house. And then as you work your way down it within the aristocracy, you'll see maybe some bronze or copper, and in the middle class. But woe be to the lower class if they have any metal in their clothes at all. It's just not allowed. And so yeah, you'll see that in the prose, but that's not something we've really gone into in the comic, which a lot of it has to do with just time and space and budget.
Sure.
Yeah.
Trivia, what do you think about how do you start building on like I don't know, a cohesive visual look for your world and your characters?
So with licensed stuff, oftentimes that has been provided for us in a big way. But uh, as we've been developing, like books and illustrations, it's like you have to try to build that existing um, visual language into what the new art will look like too, right? So I'm trying to be very vague because I'm working on a ton of unannounced stuff right now, and NDA. So if you're working on a project that is set in the U.S. In a certain time frame, right? Like you have all of the art that is given from the license holder and whatnot, but then you can go and build out what's related to that they haven't touched on yet. Like so, what do kids at what do school age children look like at this time, right? Even if it's all adults, maybe there's kids in a picture, and so you're trying to fill in all the gaps that has been left by the license that you have to cover. I do a lot of the art buying and art writing for artists, so I spend a lot of time on Google image search, trying to find, you know, either different angles of stuff that I haven't been able to find in what we've been given from the license holder, or you know, just enough visual things that I can give to an artist and not get back something way off base. Because like if there's a pillar that I know about, I have to share it, right? And it's it never feels good, you know, as an illustrator when you're like, I tried really hard and tried some new things, and you turn it in and they're like, cut this, cut this, cut this, cut this, right? So I try to set up all the projects for my illustrators in ways that, you know, that saves everybody time and like angst, to be given enough structure that they can be creative in the right lane.
Totally. Yeah, I feel like on the practical end of things, how I like build up my visual library is just like you're saying, like Google image search, making Pinterest boards. Also like I found that was help a thing that was helpful was researching like cultures that are in similar like biomes but are like from way different areas. So like for example, like like you have Sahara desert style clothing, which is like, lots of drapery and very light like cottony fabric. And then like if you go to like Pe Pueblo Indians, in like New Mexico area, you have like people that have like yucca fiber clothing, and they actually don't cover themselves that much. And so it's like interesting to see how different cultures handle like similar environments, and like culturally why that is. Also researching like, okay, well, why are they using, why are they more, they're not interested in like draping themselves. Like, why is that? Is it like a, I don't know, maybe are they draping themselves for modesty? Are they draping themselves because it's easier to like, keep your temperature down when you're completely covered, things like that.
Is like making fabric easier, right?
Yeah,
Like if yucca fibers take a ton of time versus I'm making things up. Like, you know, everybody knows how to make cotton, right?
yeah.
And then it's really available.
Yeah, exactly. There's just so many interesting, like, kind of like not arbitrary choices, but there's things like there's another Indian culture that they kind of embraced wearing like these big linen wraps, and I was like, why did they choose to wear that? Because it's not like that wasn't like part of their culture earlier, and it was because when like white people were like during the like Western like colonization times, they found it offensive that they were bare, and so they would give them like linen blankets to like cover themselves. And then they were just like, okay, this is like kind of cool, and like incorporated it. So there's a lot of things like cultural clash that you can also like incorporate, and doesn't actually have to be like so practical. It can just be like, actually like your chi-chis are out and you need to cover them. um so yeah.
Yeah, I
There's
mean,
someone
what
in the
else?
chat also.
Oh,
Oh,
go
go ahead, go
ahead.
ahead.
No,
No,
I
no,
was just
no.
thinking. I was just thinking, out loud that it would also be an indication uh, in of industry and economics, um, that out in the desert, though it may be the same biome as in New Mexico or Arizona, you didn't have the essentially industrialization. I mean, not mechanized industrialization, but you had the whole Fertile Crescent economic boom of weavers and tradesmen and that traveled everywhere, which you wouldn't have in the American Southwest during the same time period. So I mean, you have that to reflect on your world as well, and what kind of fibers you would have available to weave to make whatever clothing you got. But yeah, I imagine trying to make clothing out of yucca fibers would be very time intensive.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah,
So
there's
like
so
in
many.
world building, also thinking
Mhm.
about what's around everything that
Yeah.
you're currently working on.
Yeah, there's so many directions you can arrive at certain looks or like aesthetics. So yeah, it's kind of fun to think about all the all the backstory. Once you make like a visual choice, you can be like, why is this happening? Why is this, you know, a thing in this world? Yeah, maybe we can also get into now, like, you know, we're talking about, you know, we build our visual libraries by doing like a lot of research, you know, Googling, doing like more scholarly backstory research on why things are the way they are. But how do you like, I don't know, digest those influences into something that is unique, but also not like appropriative or like stereotypical? Like, how do you like, I don't know, handle and balance that? I don't know. Karis, do you want to go first?
Yeah, well, I think that's also quite a difficult question, right? Like, it really depends on like each project and each person. But I think the line maybe for appropriation is also about intent and money. You know, so why are you choosing to specifically, you know, like replicate this thing? Are you the one making a lot of money off of it? Compared to let's say, you know, the culture where it originates from, or kind of like why are you doing it? Because I think there is a big difference between someone kind of playing with a design for their own kind of exercise and not really publishing it, compared to a big company kind of taking that thing and you know, like fashion companies nowadays, and then selling it, and none of the profits go back to the original community. So yeah, I think I would try to think kind of beyond just the image, and also like what is the artist's intent, and how is the whole project framed, like in what context are we kind of talking about this.
And I try when I'm pulling from different places to, and Charis, you talked about this, like figure out why that symbol or why that shape or why that part of the garment was important. Like to call an example, right? Like the Japanese like furisode, right? With the really long sleeves, the kimono for young women. Like the really long sleeves are for young women, but if you just like took that bit and put it on something else that now like everyone of every age wears or something like that removes the like symbol of marriage when then your sleeves get shorter or things like that. So it's just like taking this element that had some level of meaning and removing it entirely just because you want long sleeves.
Stripping the
So
meaning.
yeah, so like something I try to do, and then also working with sensitivity consultants and people from those cultures to double check my work, right? Is you know, try to find something that is like not sacred, not you know, a right or you know, limited use patterns, things like that, and always checking it with someone else before you go too far and then have to make a apologetic blog post about it. And you know, when you're working with really big stuff, like really big IPs, that can reflect poorly on the publisher and the license holder as well. So I have to be very careful and err on the side of caution. So
Yeah, I think it's do your research. I
Hmm.
mean, yeah, you really have to do your research, and then if you're going to change something, I mean, you need to have a really good reason, and it needs to resonate from your world, and you know, while being respectful. It's like, yeah, I know what Karis is talking about. Like, there was a couple of fashion companies that slapped some Native American symbols on their clothing and paraded it around, and it was like, no, that was not appropriate.
well, and you know, trademarked or copyrighted it too. So then
Oh
there was
yeah.
legal stuff, and it's
Oh my God. Yeah.
no.
One way I look at that whole discussion of appropriation is it's kind of like an expansion of the idea of the uncanny valley and how we've gone from, you know, a society that was privileging the viewpoint, like certain viewpoints of what's uncanny valley and what's accepted, like just automatically like, oh, okay, this is good enough, and expanding it to more, you know, a more diverse subset of people and what they feel are things that, you know, would be uncanny valley to them, and alienate them from the world that you're trying to build. And I mean, thankfully, I guess in my case, even though like, I'm drawing, some of my mental library is certainly influenced by, all the travel I've done and, all sorts of different cultural influences. But, if you can cite things in a very, very different context, then that can help pull it away from a question of whether this is a very, something that's going to trigger that uncanny valley reflex and that alienation. So it hasn't come up maybe as much as it would if I were setting something more within human history, like many of the projects that you guys have talked about do. But I do think it is, it's something that, we need to be aware of, like, okay, we have our perspective of what's going to trigger that. Oh, this is sort of close to something that I know, but just off enough to be really upsetting, and how different those triggers can be for other people.
That's interesting. I've never really thought about Uncanny Valley in relation to like appropriation in that sense. Like I always automatically obviously go to like robots and like
Right.
humanoids that are like kind of missing, but that is kind of a similar emotional reaction. It's like just missing it's just like unsettling in a way when you see something that's been like kind of cannibalized
Yeah.
and is suddenly out of context. Um yeah, that's really interesting. Um Also, time flew by really fast. Like, I think we
did.
only have like,
We have like
That's how these things go.
yeah.
5 or 6 minutes. Yeah, yeah.
Let me see if I can, maybe a last question. Um, I don't know. What are some things, some like, maybe like one pet peeve that you see in world building that you wish people would be more like aware of or not do? I feel like that might be a good thing. Like, something like for example, I'll go first. Like I really don't like when like I'll pick on Disney because they're, a monstrous conglomerate, so I'm not afraid to like be mean to them. But like for example, Moana, like they were trying to circumvent the kind of um appropriation by kind of blending Polynesian cultures a lot. So you had like Hawaiian, you had like Samoan stuff, and it was all kind of like intertwined. And to me, that was like it kind of cheapened the world building a bit. Like I felt like that made it really shallow because they're like trying to cover their bases so that everyone kind of like it's like, oh, it's like just like pan Polynesian. Like everyone's, it's about everyone in the Pacific. And I was like, eh. But yeah, that's one thing that I like. There's this author, his name is Guki Wathiango. He's a an African author, and he says that university is a child of particularity. And I feel like that's a big thing that I would love to see more with world building is just be very like particular about all the choices that you make in your world. Like and all the things that we talked about from like fashion to environment, like just make it all make sense and don't try to like just kind of like soften the edges of your influences so that it's like, oh, it's kind of, this it's inclusive but also very vague because I feel like that's a little bit insulting in a way, but yeah, that's my pet peeve. So if anyone wants to throw out their peeves too.
I
I have
I,
a
I think
oh,
mine kind of just falls in with yours. Is that it's inconsistency in world building, where
Hmm.
they've started down one path and then all of a sudden it veers off into another, but the world hasn't. There's no foundation for that yet.
Hmm.
Or they do.
Incoherence.
It's just, yeah, it's incoherence and inconsistency within the world building. It's you can have the most wacky world building you could possibly want, and I'm gonna go there for the ride as long as it's consistent. I can suspend my disbelief for so many things because
Hmm.
I love it, but as long as you stay on the path that you've set, and then I'm good. But if there's any inconsistency or something comes out of left field, then yeah, that's a pet peeve.
one of mine is when you're given a world where it's it's not obvious that there should be like different cultures or races or whatnot, and then all of a sudden you are shown them because one is brought up that is now othered. So like you'll have a whole cast of characters that you've been with for years, and then all of a sudden they go to, you know, fantasy Asia or fantasy Africa or whatnot, and you're like, oh, I didn't realize all the dragons were white until they've now gone to fantasy Africa where we have non-white dragons, you know, things like that. So like and I get that there is some like diversity feelings in that, right? Like, oh, now, you know, maybe a kid will see themselves in this, but it's like they already were because these are dragons and everybody loves dragons.
Everybody loves dragons.
Yeah, we didn't have to go there. So yeah, and I'm sure there's you know an opposing argument of like having those specific touchstones in characters that you know people from a culture can recognize and then feel you know included in the group. But like when
Mhm.
we have not set this on Earth, it is now very surprising to have an Earth
Mm.
thing that others a whole group. So
Yeah.
that's my pet peeve.
Yes, that's a good one.
I
Karis,
think
Bruce.
I'd say that people taking Tolkien as the template for world building is probably my pet peeve. You know, Tolkien was very good
So true.
at his world building, but he
Mhm.
was world building based on his expertise and his interests, and his interest was linguistics and you know ancient European mythology. And so I think that people can take their specific interests and they can approach world building in a completely different way. You know, it doesn't all have to start with inventing all of your languages. It doesn't even have to include, you know, inventing all your languages if the particular scope of your project doesn't really need that or doesn't focus that because maybe that's not what your interest area is. You know, like I think we can all, you know, we can all find a way to world build that is native to ourselves. Um, and I think it'll be a much more interesting field for it.
I love that. Karis, last peeve.
Yeah, well, before the peeve, just echoing what you said about Disney, because as you guys might know, Disney recently put out a Southeast Asian
Mm.
inspired movie, and all my friends who are Southeast Asian, like, you know, we watched the trailer and we were like, we do not see ourselves in this. We kind of feel like we've been cut up into different pieces and like collaged together. And then on the contrary, people who were not familiar with the culture were like, wow, you know, the world building is so great, it looks so cool. So I think that says something about how you will have different audiences and you know, so which audience are you really privileging in the way that you build your world? Um, and I guess just the peeve actually builds off what Bruce said about Tolkien. And it's about maps. Like, you know, maps don't have to look like Tolkien's maps. He was not, you know, good. Well, his maps were more, I think, to serve his story. And he didn't like if you look at the mountains around Mordor, they're like literally a rectangle. Like I don't
Yeah.
think it's
There's not much
geologically
geology
possible for those
underlying it.
mountains
Yeah.
to exist. Um, yeah, but even just the aesthetics, right? Like you see that a lot in fantasy maps where it's like, okay, there's like the black ink line and maybe like the labels will be in red ink because that's how they printed Tolkien's maps for the past few decades. So yeah, I think just when it comes to maps, you know, I look at different kinds of maps from across history, from cultures all over the world. There are so many other ways to make maps.
Totally. I wish
Well,
I
I like the way you make maps, Karis.
yeah. You
I
make some
got your
sick
name
maps.
here. I got the name. You'll be hearing from me.
Well, this was a great conversation, y'all. Thank you so much. Do you want to plug maybe where people can find you? Trivia, do you want to start doing your
Yeah,
plugs?
so I'm on Twitter at dark_deer_, because all the other ones were taken. And I post very rarely, but I try to boost stuff when I see it. So
Nice. Bruce?
Well, I'm brucebernaise.com, but my last name is a bit tough to deal with, so you can easily find me on Twitter at Bruce Draws.
Perfect. Karis?
Yeah, carislook.com, same thing on Twitter, and then also for the people who are excited about maps, like Sunday we're doing a panel that's all about maps and world building, so that's going to be fun. Do come along for that.
I'm so there. Madeline?
Uh, get me on Kickstarter, Boston Metaphysical Society, the Book of Demons, and also bostonmetaphysicalsociety.com. Twitter, M. Holly Rosing, and Instagram is MC Holly #1.
Yay. And I'm sloansloan.com, Sloan on Twitter, Sloan Young on Instagram. All right. Thank you so much. This was
Thank
great.
you.
thank
Have a good rest of
you.
your
Thank
day.
you.
See ya.
Bye.
Bye.